afternoon. Welcome to our webinar with Dominic Pacyga discussing Clout City. Dominic and I are old friends, so he is the perfect person to have my first webinar where I'm running the show behind the scenes. So any technical issues are all mine. I'm Elsie. I'm the new executive director of Chicago Collections Consortium, and we're thrilled to have you join us today. I'll be driving the slides, and Dominic will tell me when to go next. And we'll have time for Q&A at the end, and you will be able to see Q&A in the webinar. So let's kick this off with a discussion with Dominic Pacyga. I first want to start with our land acknowledgement. Chicago Collections Consortium acknowledges and is grateful for the Native peoples who laid the foundation for the city of Chicago and for the diverse indigenous nations that reside in Chicago today. When you visit our member organizations and when you experience Chicago's outdoor spaces, we invite you to join in offering respect and gratitude to the many indigenous peoples that reside in the Chicagoland region, as well as their ancestors. We invite you to check out the Explore Chicago website portal, searching for collections all across our member institutions. Check out our events. We front-loaded, so there are some future events there. And we really can't do this without our generous supporters. We have foundation support and we have individual contributions. Share with us on social media. We're on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram. And I am thrilled to have Dominic Pacyga, Professor of History Emeritus at Columbia College, Chicago, affiliated faculty member in the Department of History at UIC, and curator at the Packingtown Museum on the West Side. Dominic, take it away.
Hi. Well, good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. Let me just say that I'm going to be talking about Clout City, which covers the political life of the city from about 1870 till recently. Next slide. And so let me begin with Mayor William B. Ogden. And here, we need to discuss how politics occurred before 1870. And it was really what we called parlor politics. That is, groups of men and women would meet in parlors of the elite, discuss the things that should happen in Chicago, and do. And so we have a sort of ruled by an elite group of businessmen. As the city grew, and as you know, it grew by vastly large numbers very quickly, different ethnic groups began to come in, and you begin to see a different kind of politics emerging, especially after the fire of 1870. Okay, next slide. Next slide. So St. Bridget's, I focus on a couple of institutions in particular, the sacred and the profane. What I mean by the sacred and profane is sort of downtown versus the neighborhood. When I talk to my students, I would ask them, what do you think was the most important building in the medieval city? And they would say, the cathedral. And when I asked them about the industrial city, they would say, well, um, um, the office building. So no matter how you take the idea of the skyscrapers reaching up into the heavens, it's not the heavens that it represents, but it's business. So if there is any sacred in the city, it's in the neighborhoods, in the many parishes and churches and synagogues and mosques that grow up in the city. And I believe in my book, I make this idea about the Catholic and Jewish communal response, which is so important in creating what we knew as the democratic machine, which has passed away. Let's go to the next slide. So one of the other institutions besides parishes that I focus on is De La Salle Institute. I'm a proud graduate of De La Salle Institute. I think I'm the only one who didn't run for mayor. But at De La Salle, especially at the turn of the century and the early part of the first half of the 20th century, De La Salle emphasized loyalty, loyalty to the church, loyalty to the school, labor, loyalty to the neighborhood and the city, to friends, and unofficially to the Democratic Party. It emphasized hierarchy and fairness, do what is right, a sense of sin. And five mayors graduated from the university, from the De La Salle Institute. Not only five mayors, but lots of aldermen and precinct captains and firemen and policemen and businessmen, and even George Dunn, who lived on the north side but went to school on the south side to De La Salle and became the head of the Democratic Party. On the other side of the coin, next slide, is Jewish Chicago and the communal response from Jewish Chicago. This was once the third largest Jewish city in the world. After New York and Warsaw, Poland, Chicago was the third largest Jewish city in the world. And there was a tremendous communal response. There were perhaps over 1,000 Landsmannschaften groups, okay, synagogues, Jewish organizations, labor organizations. All these came together to blend a sort of communal web. So this Catholic peasant communal web and this Jewish communal web, out of that and that hardscrabble existence in Bridgeport and other neighborhoods like it, you began to see the emergence of the machine. Next slide. The Harrisons. Now, the Carter Harrison the first, actually it's Carter Harrison the third and Carter Harrison the fourth, his son, Carter Harrison the third, or the first Carter Harrison mayor, roamed the city on horseback. His son roamed the city on bicycle, showing the sort of technological change between the two administrations. Each mayor was elected 5 times. This tends to be a tradition in Chicago. You hand it off to your son. We can think of the Dailies, but there are other examples of this as well. But the Harrisons were really interesting because even this fact that Harrison, the first Harrison, was a slave owner originally in Kentucky, moved to Chicago, sold his slaves, sold the plantation, moved to Chicago, made his fortune. Even though that's true, um, he understood these new ethnic groups. He had a tremendous memory that he could actually memorize various phrases in various languages, and so he would greet Irish groups in Gaelic. He would greet Germans and he was fluent in German, so the Germans were the largest voting bloc. He could greet them in German. His son also, who was raised basically in Germany, was able to do that. Now, his son, Carter Harrison the fourth, actually went to St. Ignatius High School. I'm sorry, St. Ignatius College, which became Loyola University, and married a Catholic girl. And they became a bridge to these new ethnic groups that were popping up in the city. And, there was a reaction against this, of course, because it had been a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant city. It had been run by parlor politics. The upper classes were seeing politics sort of slipping out of their hands. And the Harrisons were never able to create a citywide machine, but there was a proto machine which emerged. Next slide. And that was the work of Mayor Big Bill Thompson, the last Republican mayor of the city of Chicago, and the creator really of a sort of Republican machine, which was, and what's interesting about Big Bill Thompson is he's sort of a demagogue. He attacked his opponents constantly. He called them names. He made fun of them. At one point, he had a rally in a downtown theater in which he brought out 2 big stockyard rats and addressed them by the names of his opponents in the Republican Party. And he came up with this term, America First, which you may understand has been popping up quite a bit recently again, and was later actually used by pro-fascist organizations in the 1930s and early 1940s. His machine was based on a sort of revival of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant and older immigrant groups coming back to power. And he was elected 3 times in the 1920s. He had his most famous, of course, supporter was someone you probably have not heard of called Alphonse Capone. Capone was a big supporter of Harrison, gave him a lot of money. Apparently, in Capone's office, he had a picture of George Washington on a wall next to a big picture of Big Bill Thompson as these 2 heroes of America. Uh, Thompson's last administration ended in a scandal. He was also had a breakdown during his administration, and he was beat by the next mayor of the city of Chicago. Next slide, who was the only foreign-born immigrant mayor in the city's history, Anton Chermak or Cermak, okay, who was born in Bohemia, now in the Czech Republic. The interesting thing about Cermak is he was a bridge builder from the very beginning. By the way, he also grew up in a very hardscrabble town, Coal City, to the south west of the city, southeast of the city of Chicago. He also was a gang member in Pilsen. He did not go have a education, higher education, but he was an important businessman, and he became a bridge builder. He was a free thinker, or at least had free thinker. So the Czechs come in four flavors: Czech Protestants, Czech Catholics, Czech free thinkers, and Czech Jews. The free thinkers were the largest group, and he was involved with the free thinkers. He's buried in Bohemian National Cemetery, which is the free thinker cemetery. But he married a Catholic woman. So from the very beginning, he had to sort of make a bridge to other groups in the Czech community. And from that, he learned how to build bridges across ethnic rivalries. Part of the problem, Chicago always held up Tammany Hall as something they wanted to be like Tammany Hall in New York. But because of Chicago's very diverse ethnic groups and the fact that they were pretty much equally powerful, it was very difficult to build these bridges. Cermak was able to build bridges to the German, the Jewish, and the Polish community. And then he took over the Democratic Party and became mayor of the city of Chicago. Um, he was the founder, really, of the Democratic citywide machine. You might call him the George Washington of the Democratic Party in Chicago. Now, as you all know, he after Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected, Cermak was in Florida, as all mayors of Chicago like to spend the winter someplace else. And he greeted uh, Franklin Roosevelt, and a shot rang out, missed Roosevelt, and hit Cermak. Now, supposedly, Cermak's words to the president at that time, it was something like, thank God it was me, Mr. Roosevelt, not you. Knowing Cermak, who did not like Roosevelt, it probably said something like, it's too bad it wasn't you, Franklin, not me. But anyway, he died a few weeks later, and Frank Corr became the interim mayor of Chicago. Frank Corr, that nobody's really heard of, was mayor for a very small, short period of time. Um, Corr um, is the first De La Salle mayor, the first of five. And his tenure is very short because he's certainly replaced, next slide, by Mayor Ed Kelly. Now, if Cermak could be called the George Washington of the machine, Mayor Kelly would probably be the Andrew Jackson of the machine, and he solidified Democratic control in the city. He brought African Americans into the organization by building sort of sub machines in neighborhoods. He was a World's Fair mayor. He saw the city through the Great Depression, World War II, and was the first real Bridgeport mayor. Okay. And his tenure would last from 1933 to 1947. And it's important because, Kelly Kelly was really, he came out of the hardscrabble of Bridgeport, didn't live much of his life in Brighton Park, became a successful businessman, a successful politician, um, was also a bridge builder, and that he was friends with Colonel McCormick of the Tribune, which was a Republican. Built this machine up, and finally, by 1947, he perhaps had outlived his use in many ways. The machine was filled with corruption, etc. But importantly, he was able to build not only a citywide machine, but to extend democratic power into the suburbs because he was the head of the Civil Defense Department for the city of Chicago and for the state of Illinois. And so you saw this growth of this machine. Jake Arvey, who came back from World War II and was the head of the Democratic Party, began to look around for a replacement. Because of all the corruption, they were starting to run what we might call goo-goos, or good candidates. So he looked at Stephen Douglas to be a senator. He turned around and he supported, next slide, um, um, uh, previous one. Get the previous slide? Yeah. Uh, this is Martin Connelly. This is the 11th Ward picnic in 1947. Martin Connelly is another Bridgeport mayor. Okay. And he's posing here with another person who will become mayor from Bridgeport. They are both De La Salle graduates. They both come out of that sort of communal organization. They're both Bridgeport-born politicians, De La Salle graduates. This is the 11th Ward picnic in 1947 at Pilsen Park, which is on 26th in Albany, or Blue Island in Albany. And this is the rally for that organization. Next slide. Martin Kennelly is mayor from 1947 to 1955 when Richard J. Daley moves against him and pushes him out. The thing about Martin Kennelly is he's a businessman. He actually makes the announcement that he doesn't believe in patronage. Patronage is the lifeblood of the Democratic Party at this point. He doesn't believe in patronage. He doesn't want to tell people who to vote for. He doesn't want to be a leader in that kind of way. He wants to be sort of a good businessman, somebody who will um, run the city in a sort of business fashion. Um, so this must have really shocked committeemen all over the city. They had just built this machine up. It was finally actually more powerful than Tammany Hall in many ways. Tammany Hall was already falling apart by 1933. Um, Kennelly looks about town and says, "No, no, I'm not I support liberal, progressive candidates. I'm a New Dealer. I don't believe in patronage, etc." And so Daley is able to effectively move against him and get the nomination in 1955. Next slide. But Kennelly decides he's going to run as an independent. So here we have a flyer that he sent out to tens of thousands of De La Salle and St. Mel and other Christian Brothers schools in the city. The Christian Brothers ran De La Salle and St. Patrick's and several other schools in the city. And you have a Christian brother teaching Kennelly and his fellow classmates of 1905, without ever mentioning that, next slide, that his opponent, of course, is also a De La Salle graduated and sat in those same desks. Here we see the man who really firmly constructs the democratic machine, which, by the way, lasts through his tenure, but then begins to fall apart. Richard J. Daley came from Bridgeport originally, did not live in Bridgeport all his life. He actually lived in St. Leo's Parish to the far south of south of Inglewood, with his grandmother for a while. When he got married, he built a cottage back in Bridgeport, moved back. He always maintained his relationship with what was first the Fifth Ward and now the 11th Ward Democratic Party. He grew up under the guidance of Big Joe McDonough, who was the alderman of the Fifth Ward at the time, Bridgeport, um, and learned how to do politics from Anton Cermak and Kelly. Um, Learned how not to do politics under Kennelly, and became mayor for some 21 years. Next slide. Um, what was Bridgeport and De La Salle's impact on the Dailies? Okay, first of all, Catholicism and a special kind of communal Catholicism, this idea of this communal web. Um, there's always been a struggle, and I think in American society, between individualism and communalism. There's sort of conflict between the two. We like the myth of the Lone Ranger or the Daniel Boone going off into the wilderness alone. The only thing is that Daniel Boone didn't go off alone. He went off with a lot of other people. And, we know that the West was largely settled by cities originally as people began to spread across and towns and cities and villages, etc. So Catholicism becomes an important impact on him. So does working class culture, the Democratic Party, the Chicago way, a Bridgeport way, labor unions, patronage, the idea of our share, which has always been a political idea in the city. And this results in clout. Next one. So I have a little quote here from Steve Goodman. It would be funny if heaven was just like the 11th Ward and you had to know the right people to receive your just reward. But you see, that was a sort of idea in popular Catholicism. St. Jude, pictured here, is the patron saint of lost causes. So if you can't get God to listen to you to any other way, you go to St. Jude. St. Jude intervenes on your behalf. I, product of Catholic education, as both the grammar school and high school, I remember in grammar school we were told all kinds of stories, like interventions of various saints, especially of the Blessed Virgin. Okay. Now, if you think about clout and patronage and having a patron saint, you can see the cultural connection between the two. And I think that it becomes very important. So, yeah, it would be funny if heaven was just like the 11th ward and you had to receive had to know the right people to receive your just reward. I remember a story told us in grammar school about a young man who never sinned, but never did anything good. And so when he died, he ended up at the pearly gates, and St. Peter said, I can't let you in, Jim. You know, let me call down and see if Lucifer will take him. Lucifer says, I can't take him in. He hasn't sinned. So he was condemned to walk around the walls of heaven for eternity, in the mist. And as he's walking along the wall and he doesn't know what's going to happen, if he's going to have to do this for the rest of eternity, he sees the Virgin standing on the top of the wall. And the Virgin looks down and says, Jim, what are you doing down there? And he says, well, Mother, I can't get into heaven. I haven't done anything good. And I can't go to hell because I haven't done anything bad. So I'm condemned to be outside the walls of both places for eternity. She says, oh, no, no. She says, you always said the rosary. And she takes her rosary and she lets it down and she lifts him up into heaven. And she says, don't worry. I know the owner. I know my son. So you'll be fine in heaven. Well, if God and the saints can do that for you, then certainly an alderman or a committeeman can be your patron in Chicago. So there's that kind of cultural connection. Next slide. And the machine was really, based on favors and jobs, ethnicity and labor unions. Patronage became the lifeblood of the machine. And Daly understood that was in the very marrow of his bones. Next slide. Um, Another quote from Steve Goodman. He was always known as the working man's pal. He grew up in Bridgeport and studied law at De La Salle. He didn't study law at De La Salle, but he studied accounting and he knew very well how to run the books. But he always was pictured as just a regular guy, a boy from the stockyards. And that was important in a Democratic Party that was emerging in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Next slide. He became a builder, a kingmaker, a master politician, a problem solver. And there were kids who grew up thinking his first name was Mayor instead of Richard J. Daley. 22 years old, 22 years as mayor, 21 years as mayor. The city saw a spurt of growth in the 1950s and 1960s, but change was in the air. Next slide. Vatican II and Humanae Vitae, the encyclical that barred Catholics from using birth control. Vatican II resulted in liturgical changes. Latin was lost from the Mass. And there's this idea that when you lose your language, you lose your culture. And to an extent, that happened in the American church, especially. There were changes in the dress of clerical and religious orders. Nuns began to dress like everyday people, right? Instead of just in their religious habits. There became a shift in the culture of the American Catholic Church. It became less defensive. Jack Kennedy was president. He was the first Catholic, right? You had this wonderful Pope John the 23rd, who seemed to, throwing windows open and letting in fresh air in the church. One of the results, however, was the loss of priests, nuns, and brothers. They began to no longer dominate the teaching base of the church. And the church began to lose teaching credibility under Paul VI, the Pope Paul VI, when he issues Humanae Vitae and really attacks birth control. And the whole thing became very much a stress on the structure of the church and on neighborhood culture. There were some 400 Catholic parishes in the Archdiocese of Chicago in 1955. Today, there are less than 200. And there's talk that there'll be less than 50 in the next 30 years. There's been a tremendous loss of personnel. Nuns basically taught for free. Suddenly, they were either leaving or they were demanding pay, or they were demanding that they shouldn't teach, but they should work doing other liturgical kinds of work. So Vatican II really shook things up, and Humanae Vitae sort of was a nail in much of the coffin. And what this meant for communal Catholicism is it began to lose its control over its culture and the rise of American individualism and this clash between the two began to rip apart the structure that it was really basic. And the same thing was happening in the Jewish religion at the time too. Reformed Judaism, the breakdown of Landsmannschaft groups, this intermarriage, uh, which was affecting all ethnic groups at this time. You began to see the decline of this idea of a communal response. Next one, next one. And of course, the 68 King riots, the Democratic Convention, and the Shachtman Decree, which basically attacked the whole idea of patronage. This is Mr. Shachtman in the slide here. Suddenly, the idea of Mayor Kennelly saying he didn't believe in patronage suddenly began to come to the fore through the courts. And increasingly, Richard J. Daley was on the defensive. Next slide. And often was seen as a reactionary, even towards the end of his life, especially here as pictured at the 68 convention, which was such a catastrophe for the Democratic Party and for Chicago as a whole. Here we see the two mayors of the city of Chicago yelling at the convention. It began to and I don't have the time or the space to talk about it here, but it's talked about in the book, bring down Daley's health. He had a stroke, and then, of course, later he has a heart attack and dies, and he's replaced, next slide, of course, by Michael J. Bilandic. We know the story of the snowstorm of 1979, which ended his career as a mayor. Bilandic was also a De La Salle graduate. He was also a Bridgeport boy. And he would be the fourth mayor from the city, from Bridgeport, and the third from De La Salle, the fourth from De La Salle. And of course, we know who replaced him, Jane Byrne. Next slide. And Jane Byrne was really a different, shall we say. It was only that she was a woman, first woman mayor, but she was the daughter of a vice president of a company. She grew up in Saguenash, not in Bridgeport. She came from a very elite school background. She was certainly very different, and she clashes with the Dailies almost immediately. Of course, she runs on this idea that she is going to be a reformer, and then immediately she dumps her reformist um, advisors and embraces the Verdoliak-Burke Rhodey machine. Because these are the people she knew. She came out of the machine. She was a favorite of Richard J. Daley's. But the Daleys themselves, after Richard J. Daley passes, do not really like her, especially Sis Daley, the wife of Richard J. Daley. The Daleys try to influence her, get some of their people put into power in her cabinet. She says, no, not going to happen. I'm doing my own thing. And of course, that leads to the 1983 election, in which it's Richard M. Daley against Jane Byrne and against Mayor Harold Washington. Next slide. Who, of course, becomes mayor. He's the first African American mayor. His legacy is very important because he reaches out to neighborhoods. He sees these sort of embodiment of neighborhood as sort of reaching out to the sacred. Now, I talk about this clash between the sacred and the profane in the book quite a bit. And one of the examples I have is something that happens under the Richard J. Daley administration. That is the creation of the University of Illinois at Chicago, my alma mater, which, of course, was a great benefit to the city of Chicago over time as the first four-year public university in the city. But took out an Italian American, Mexican American, Greek neighborhood, basically to create it on the near west side. So here was the clash between the sacred and the profane, between the neighborhood and downtown. The people of Garfield Park wanted UIC, what was then called the Chicago Circle. Uh, but downtown interests wanted it closer to downtown to protect downtown from the ghetto, especially the West Side ghetto. And indeed, that's where UIC was positioned, taking out a fairly vibrant Italian neighborhood, a Mexican neighborhood, and Greek neighborhood. Harold began to talk then about helping neighborhoods grow and develop themselves, and often actually referred to the model of the back of the yards neighborhood council and those neighborhood groups that were created to preserve neighborhood. Next one. But of course, the Verdoli Act 29. Next slide. So, of course, we have Beirut on the Lake, the 29 aldermen, the Verdoli Act 29, opposing Harold in the city council until, of course, finally he gets control of the city council in the beginning of his second term and has a massive heart attack in office and dies. Now what happens? Well, the white aldermen and many black aldermen who had sort of been upset with Harold's rule because he controlled them, and used his political power in the African American community to really control these black aldermen. They sort of rebelled against this idea. Next slide. And after his death, they elect Eugene Sawyer, and the city council appoints Eugene Sawyer basically as the mayor. And Sawyer is this sort of transitional character. He doesn't really want to be mayor at the very beginning. He's upset about it. People want Tim Evans to be mayor. There's actually people holding nooses outside. I don't know if you remember this, but the crowds outside City Hall and in City Hall that during that tumultuous meeting that went till I think 4 in the morning, um, where they were threatening to hang Sawyer if he accepted the nomination. But of course, this is, and the bottom here is Alderman Mell getting up and saying, "We have a mayor," the election of Gene Sawyer, and the defeat of Tim Evans. And of course, this sets up another election in 1989. The black community is divided between Tim Evans and Eugene Sawyer. The white community gets quickly behind another candidate and another Daley. Next slide. Who basically comes out as a sort of younger and progressive Daley. This, by the way, is a famous picture of Daley's by Skrebneski, his friend, the famous fashion photographer. So he projects himself as a younger, progressive Daley. Certainly, his administration will not be his father's machine. It's based on a different methods. He sees himself as a hands-on administrator. He reaches out to what I call the Starbucks voter, the sort of lakefront liberal voter. He reaches out for the gay vote. While Harold Washington was the first mayor to walk in the Gay Pride Parade, Daley embraces the gay community, helps to create the Gay Hall of Fame, which he is very important in. And he reaches out to African American conservatives. And in 1989, next slide, he is, of course, this restoration takes place, this sort of the return of the Daleys. Here we see him being sworn in Orchestra Hall. Now, an important factor in Daley, next slide, is Maggie Daley. Maggie Daley's a very interesting woman. She forces Rich Daley to travel. She takes him to places like Beijing and to Paris. The Daleys, his father had gone to Ireland a few times, but that was about it. But Maggie Daley makes him become a world traveler in which he gets different ideas about cities. And he kind of rebels against the sort of modernist approach of his father in restoring the city. Modernist approach, there's the idea of the embracing of high rises, the creation of a campus like the Illinois Institute of Technology, or the building of the Stateway Gardens Robert Taylor homes along the Dan Ryan Expressway, which is sort of Corbusier on steroids. And he begins to react against this. Next slide. And we begin to see his administration planting these streetscapes, with which when they were put in, politicians made fun of. but I think Chicagoans appreciate it along Michigan Avenue and other parts of the city. He projects himself as the green mayor, right? He revives the Burnham Plan to an extent and has sees himself as sort of a postmodernist image. This is all very positive in the first few terms, right? As he continues, he begins to be painted in a darker and darker light. Next slide. Of course, we all remember the Meigs Field closing in 2003. I was in Saigon when this happened, and I got an email from my wife saying, "My God, Rich Daley has bombed Meigs Field." It was sort of a declaration of war. Uh, and Rich Daley, his brother actually was quoted as saying that some people stay in office too long. And when they stay in office too long, the people who work for him become kind of complacent. They begin to take things for granted. Um, they begin to take money on the side. Other things kind of happen. And Rich Daley was, in the later years, was faced with various problems. Next slide. Of course, we see the hired truck scandal, privatization issues, a sort of neoliberalism, parking meters to Chicago Skyway, the Olympic loss. Now, how could Chicago lose the Olympics? Well, only by Brazil being more corrupt than Chicago and paying off the Olympic officials more than Chicago could pay them off. So they lose the Olympics of 2016. Decline in police and fire department morale, shrinking job base, and population losses. And then there's the Koshman killing, which his nephew is accused of killing this young man on Rush Street in a drunken brawl. So he's sort of sees things crumbling, just like his father saw things crumbling after 1968 to 1975 in those last 7 years. Frankly, if both men had probably not gone on to these extra terms, they'd probably be remembered with quite a bit of affection. And is probably the best mayor Chicago ever had. Uh, but as Bill Daley said, some people stay in office too long. Next slide. So what's his legacy? He's problem solver, good administrator, builder, created a global city. And then there's scandal riven. He's poorly served by associates and family. And there's this autocratic style, which becomes more and more intense. In his final years, he sees his popularity go down. And of course, Maggie Daley has cancer and is a constant, you know, stress for him. And of course, he finally decides to step down. Go ahead. Next slide. The city is facing deindustrialization, suburbanization, both of which, by the way, rip apart at the communal structure of politics, right? It goes through ethnic and racial change. Next slide. Group of Arab American Democrats, the incredible growth of the Hispanic community, Latino community, but the growth also of the Asian community and the South Asian community. And also, next slide, the emergence of really a sort of new ethnic group, the gay community, which has its own neighborhoods, has its own aldermen, uh, has its own, businesses, and really acts sort of like a traditional ethnic group. It's not based on a ethnic culture, but it's based on a different gender culture. And they become an important group that has to be dealt with politically. Next slide. The city also faces gentrification, which means the breakdown of older neighborhoods. And I like this slide. I'm not sure if you can make it out, but where it says the Wabash Club, these are African Americans gentrifying a neighborhood. The McKinley Lofts, that's a Hispanic American gentrifying McKinley Park. And of course, there in the center, you see Holy Family Church, which is next to St. Ignatius, which is on the west side, which is totally gentrifying at this point. And it means really the decline of different groups who begin to move out of the city. Next slide. We really see a decline of the Polish and white ethnic clout in the city as these transformations take place. These changes in the Catholic Church, changes in the Jewish religion, changes in the ability to create this sort of solid communal response to conditions. Next slide. In 1958, there were 4 Polish congressmen from the city of Chicago. Rostenkowski, Ed Derwinski, uh, uh, Luczynski, and of course Puczynski. There were 14 Polish aldermen. 14 Polish aldermen. Think about that. Uh, Today, there are no Polish congressmen and there are no Polish aldermen in the city council. Why? Well, they followed everybody else out to the suburbs, and their political clout is divided among hundreds of different municipalities. People come to me as a Polish American, they come to me and say, "How can we get our clout back?" I said, "Well, move back into the city." Well, we can't do that. There were 60 Polish Catholic churches in the city of Chicago and suburbs. Uh, Probably now there's less than 20. So you can see this decline. And maybe it's most symbolized by one particular election. Next slide. And that was the election of Nancy Kasich versus Rahm Emanuel in 2002. For Rostenkowski's old sake, you may remember Rostenkowski went to jail for some issue. In 2000, Chicagoans claiming Polish ancestry still made up 7.5% of the population, but their numbers dropped rapidly. In 2000, Illinois contained 933,000 people of Polish descent. Some 65% lived in Chicago's suburbs, however. Today, over 90% of Polish Americans live in the suburbs. They have been basically replaced by Latinos, by Latino Americans. And you can see it in the political structure. You can see, who's getting elected. I would suggest that perhaps if not the next mayor, one certainly soon after that would be of Hispanic heritage, because they are beginning to really show their clout and their ability to organize in the city. Of course, Emanuel, next slide, goes on to be mayor, and we know how that ended. Now, of course, he's thinking about being president. I like this little picture of him with his hand up. I think that's sort of what he says to a lot of his opponents. He had a hard-nosed kind of attitude towards these people. And of course, we now know that he was replaced by, next slide, Lightfoot and Brandon Johnson. And it's too early to talk about whether there's a new machine or not. Certainly, it's not the old machine. Brandon is elected by a combination of union supporters, the Chicago Teachers Union, the SEIU primarily. Those two are now at odds with each other. As you know, the polls show Brandon Johnson as being rather unpopular right now. He has, as many mayors have, of Chicago, fought with a Democratic governor. There's always this tension between who's really the head of the Democratic Party in Illinois. And what does the future hold for machine politics? I'll tell you, it doesn't hold for the way I define machine politics in the city of Chicago. Okay, thank you. Well, these are my books, and they're all available from University of Chicago Press. I have to give this, advertisement at the end. So maybe we can open up for questions and answers.
So do we have some Q&A? I did get an earlier one, strong echo in the audio. It might be, that's why I originally muted. That might be been an issue. So sorry about that. Other questions for Dominic? Dominic, I've got some questions.
Sure.
Reading your book, I was so struck with the first Daley administration and the real power nationally that Daley had.
Mhm.
That this, it was, go to, telling Kennedy he got Illinois for him, that kind of thing. And that are we ever going to see that again?
I doubt it. I doubt that you're ever going to have this kind of a national politician. But let me say that his four sons sort of take up the mantle in various ways. Of course, Rich Daley becomes mayor, but Bill Daley becomes the national politician. Okay. Even though he's never elected to office, he plays an important role nationally, especially in the Clinton and the Obama administration. Mike Daley, So there's two of them are De La Salle graduates. Only two, Mike and Rich, are De La Salle graduates. The other two go to St. Ignatius. So Mike Daly is sort of the behind the scenes guy. He deals with zoning issues. It's very difficult to find a picture of him even on the internet. He does not like to be out there publicly like his brothers do. And John Daly is the neighborhood guy. So they each sort of take the father's personality and divide it up in various kinds of ways. And I think they continue to play an important role, especially John Daly, who's, still a member of the Cook County Board. Um, but to see the kinds of power that the father had in one man, I think is very difficult to do again. Um, and locally, Richard J. Daley controlled 35,000 patronage jobs. His son, Richard M. Daley, controlled maybe 5,000. Now, understand that patronage is not only jobs with the city or the county. There's also a good deal of impact on private companies need favors too. And we've learned that most recently with the Michael Madigan Commonwealth Edison thing. As we saw the sort of last gasps of the machine, sort of between Eddie Burke and Mr. Madigan, Michael Madigan. Um, so so there was also a lot of this, private business needs patronage too. They need help too. And they're always going to politicians with their with their hat in their hands. And so the machine was also able to put people in the private sector. But to have that kind of power nationally also is very difficult for any man right now, I think, from a big city. Even though, Chicago supplies a lot of votes for the Democrats, always ha or has since 1931. Um, it's probably not going to see anything comparable to that. Certainly, Brandon Johnson's not going to have that, and neither did Lori Lightfoot. Rahm Emanuel tried to do it, was not very successful. I mean, it's not only the Laquan McDonald thing, but he was known as the mayor of 1%, and all this kind of stuff. Whether that's fair or not fair, it's still sort of the sort of symbolic issue for him. Yeah.
Oh, we've got some more questions that have come in. Following on the idea of the Daley family, do you anticipate Bill Daley will run again for mayor of Chicago?
I don't think Bill Daley has it in him. I really don't. Bill Daley has never been a good campaigner. There's been talk of him running for governor at one time, then he was going to run. He ran for mayor, and he pulls out. He decides not to. It's not in his blood. Uh, the two politicians were Rich and John, uh, and um, and they were the most successful. Uh, Bill Daley really, I think, likes being in power, but not by elections. And I don't think he'll ever run again. No.
Very topical question. What's your view of what ICE is doing? What will it continue to do to Chicago's voting population and thus politics?
That's a good question. I mean, I mean, I find it hard to understand what ICE is doing at any time at this point, but certainly if they're going to be surrounding voting booths in Hispanic neighborhoods, it's going to keep the voting numbers down because even citizens are afraid to do these kinds of things. I mean, there's no proof that there's any kind of, I mean, historically, there's been plenty of proof that there's been political shenanigans going out with, as far as I point out in the book that before the 1860s, 1850s, 1870s, the Irish were well known uh, to flood other wards with voting and vote illegally in other wards. And even the suburban Irish would come into the city and vote in city elections. And there was always this sort of worry about, yeah, at one point they said they don't count the votes in the ward, they weigh them because they're so, So, there were shenanigans going on, and there were, but there's no proof that that kind of stuff is going on now. In fact, Mike Madigan was one of the most important political reformers in the city, in the state, because he passed laws that pretty much did away with all that kind of stuff. But ICE is, I mean, and this creation of a national sort of police force is just been frightening. I think what it's going to do actually is going to make, there was a trend for Hispanics to vote Republican, and I think that trend has now been reversed, at least for the time being.
Another good question, and I'll try to. We've got so many good questions. How do you feel that the media has played a part in mayoral elections, and do you feel they hold the same power to elect mayors today?
Yeah, I think that, Democrats have been good at using the media in the city of Chicago. Um, But I think now with the internet and the sort of cable news and streaming and all this other stuff that's going on, you really saw the media losing its once tremendous power. I mean, remember when Walter Cronkite says basically that the war in Vietnam is not going well. They told Lyndon Johnson, if you lose Walter Cronkite, you lose the country. And then Lyndon steps down, right? I don't think there's that kind of power anymore. I think now it's so divided uh, uh, by technology. I mean, remember when not that long ago there were four stations in Chicago that you listened to, right? Two, five, seven, and nine. Who gets the news on two, five, seven, and nine anymore? I mean, it's really a sort of CNN, MSNBC, all these other kinds of things. I'm sorry, MS Now it's called, all over the place, and you don't have the kind of concentration of power that Walter Cronkite had, or Dan Rather had, or Edward R. Murrow had. I mean, here was a guy who brought down McCarthy, right? I mean, it's that kind of power, I think, has been diluted among various sources at this point.
Hi, Dominic. Thank you so much for your presentation today. Can you speak to anything about the transfer of power to the Chicago suburbs today? What sort of role does it play now that today's Chicago, in quotes, is so geographically far spread now?
Yeah, I think they're, and not only that, I mean, it used to be the suburbs voted Republican and the city voted Democratic, but the suburbs are increasingly voting Democratic because Chicagoans have moved out to the suburbs. As I said, 90% of the Polish Americans in Chicago now live in the suburbs. The suburbs there's more Hispanics living in the suburbs than there are in the city right now. I mean, that's actually kind of amazing. Look at the growth of the Black community in the suburbs, which has been phenomenal over the last 20, 30 years, and the loss of the Black community in Chicago, um, which was until recently made up by the influx of Latinos. But yeah, the suburbs are becoming more and more of a powerhouse politically. Um, but once again, because it's so divided between different townships, cities, towns, villages, cities, so you can get a Polish mayor in Justice, Illinois, but he can't be mayor in the city of Chicago and hence have this sort of national presence and national clout. Um, Once to get back to my own community, Polish American community, people also ask me about the Catholic churches and the closing of Catholic churches. How can we save those Polish parishes? My response again is move back into the parish and put $1 in the bucket every Sunday, and you'll save your parish. Uh, but once demographic change, once it begins, is very difficult to turn around. Um, and that's now going on for inner city Hispanic neighborhoods as well. And when you think about Pilsen and Little Village, you're starting to see demographic change taking place there. And I think and look at the demographic change that's taken place in Bridgeport. Bridgeport has changed ethnically very much, and even social class wise very much has become. I was in Bridgeport the other day, and it was trying to find a parking space. It was like I was on the north side. I couldn't find a parking space anywhere because it's become such a hip place to live. So you see gentrification taking place in Bridgeport. You see it happening in Bronzeville. Um, you know, it it makes no sense to me that the White Sox should move to the 78 because Bronzeville and Bridgeport are so gentrified now. There will be people who can actually afford to go to a ball game, um, and especially if it's close by, like the Sox Park is. Um, I just don't. Once demographic change takes place, I think it's very difficult to reverse. Yeah.
We have a couple more. Although this may be our last question, we'll see how we do on time. They're also good. So you talked a bit about how community organizations, churches, and structures underpinned the foundation of the machine in the 1900s. To what extent did the news media play a part then as well, with the Tribune famously Republican leaning with no effect? And how does our fragmented social media landscape impact future elections?
Wow. That's a tough one. Yeah, I mean, once you had this communal web in the 19th and 20th century, that played an important role. And of course, you remember there were a lot more newspapers then too. And there were, like, I think at one point 13 German newspapers. There were five Polish newspapers in the city. There were labor union newspapers, etc. So that media then was very, very important with the emergence of radio and then television. Radio in the 1930s transformed uh, politics. At the Chicago History Museum, the archives, you have the Polish American Democratic Organization, which is one of the first to have a regular radio program out about democratic politics in the city in the 1930s. So you see this transformation. You see the embrace of television by Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower, but also, I mean, Kennedy played it very well. Remember the Kennedy-Nixon debates. Lyndon Johnson was good on television. We forget that. Um, so that has changed tremendously, as I mentioned before. Um, but I think at the core of it is the change is really this sort of, is it community or the individual that's important? And the communal web is broken down. And it's broken down not only in Chicago, it's broken down all over the country. And this has caused, I think, part of the political chaos that we have today. Um, who votes in primaries? Um, People who really believe in something, right? I mean, either the far right or the far left. The rest of us pretty much, maybe don't. I mean, I do, but a lot of other people don't. It's not that important to them. Um, so I think that is where it's sort of playing out. I'm not sure that I've answered that question, but it was a very difficult question to try to answer. Thank you.
Well, in the minute left, can you say Chicago seems to need a strong mayor to achieve its goals? See anyone who can fill that void? Put you on the spot?
Gosh, geez. I don't know. All the people that have announced they're going to run for the next time, um, I have a feeling that I'm not sure that you're ever going to have anybody as strong as actually even Rahm Emanuel was, because now the city council has sort of found its way back. It's set up to be a powerful council, a weak mayor, but that all turned around with Cermak and Daley and Kelly. Um, uh, I think Mendoza can put together a decent coalition. Maybe Quinn, not is Marty Quinn? Yeah, on yeah, on the north side. Um, but I'm not sure that anybody will ever have the kind of strong mayor, or we will see. I think what I'll tell you, I think what we're headed for the next few terms is one-term mayors
Yeah.
because just the organization isn't there, the cohesiveness in neighborhoods isn't there. The ideological split across the country is also reflected locally. All politics are local, as Tip O'Neill said, but um, I just don't see anybody coming out and be as strong as either one of the Dailies or even Rahm Emanuel at his peak was at the time.
We'll conclude with two comments rather than questions, which sum up this hour perfectly. One of them is just a great review of history, brought back some interesting memories. Thank you. Another one, thank you. This was fantastic. Can't wait to pick up your new book, Dominic. So remember, all technical issues were mine. All wonderful conversation was Dominic's. Thank
Oh,
you so
can I
much.
say can I say one more thing?
Absolutely.
This is the Chicago Consortium played a big role in this book. So did Daniel Harper and his colleagues at Special Collections and UIC. You and Leslie Martin at CHM played a very important role. So did the Newberry Library staff, Loyola University staff, Margaret Kutt at the Polish Museum of America, the Newberry Library staff's collection of the Harrison papers, etc., and Rostenkowski at Loyola. But Dan Harper helped an awful lot, and I just wanted to say thank you to him and to all librarians and all archivists everywhere. Thank you, and thank you to the Chicago Consortium for being a great guide for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominic. Thank you so much for being such a friend to librarians and for your incredible depth of Chicago history knowledge. So
Thank you.
the program has been recorded, and once it's all up and prettied up, hopefully with my mistakes taken out, you'll get a link to it. Thank you, Dominic.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.